Thanks so much for joining today, joining the Ecological Restoration webinar. This event is hosted by CTAR, so College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources from the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and the Maui Association of Landscape Professionals, MELP. And Allison right here is the president of MELP. So thank you, Allison, for all your help. It's also hosted by the Oahe Forest Restoration Project. So Erica and Art Medeiros. My name is Hannah Luchin. I am a Maui Extension Agent for the University of Hawaii, Manoa. And before we get started, I just wanted to cover a few ground rules. So first, please keep your audio muted throughout the entire presentation. This really helps us reduce background noise so we can listen to Art and all the good things he has to say. Second, Art put together a fabulous presentation, and there will be a live question and answer session at the end of his presentation. So please stay tuned and put your questions in the chat. We will try to address as many questions as possible. Also, this webinar is approved for one landscape industry certified technician and one International Society of Arboriculture arborist continuing education units, CEUs for short. If you need CEUs, please make sure to fill out the post-webinar survey. If you have any questions, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat. And next, it's an honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Arthur C. Medeiros. Dr. Arthur C. Medeiros is the program manager of the Oahe Forest Restoration Project. Dr. Medeiros is one of Hawaii's foremost regional experts in native Hawaiian biota, natural history, ethnobotany, and restoration ecology. With this broad range of expertise, Dr. Medeiros has contributed over 70 peer-reviewed scientific publications. He founded numerous ecological restoration projects, including the Oahe Project, Hu'u'okali Wili Wili Forest Reserve, and the Leeward Haleakala Watershed Restoration Partnership. Dr. Medeiros served over 3 decades with the federal government, first as a botanist with Haleakala National Park, and then as a research biologist with USGS Pacific Island Ecosystems Research Center. Working in collaboration with Ulapalakua Ranch, Dr. Medeiros founded the Oahe Project in 1997. At inception, he brought together critical early stakeholders attempting one of the first large-scale forest restoration projects in the Hawaii Islands. The successful ongoing ecological recovery of Oahe Forest is thanks to experimentation and adaptations. And it is possible in large part due to the long-term engagement of the Maui community. This field to forest restoration model has paved the way for many other land management entities in Hawaii to adapt restoration techniques and social participation into their best management practices. To many, the Oahe Project stands as a symbol that grassroots efforts, when science-based, well-considered, and with good partners, can provide important contributions towards saving what we can of Hawaii's biocultural diversity. Today, Art will give a primer and overview of the emergent field of restoration ecology, the Oahe Project, and some thoughts on the future role of ecological restoration in Hawaii. All right, without further ado, let's listen to Art talk. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to enter it in the chat.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Title of my talk, you probably know it, Ecological Restoration in Hawaii. Are we creating sanctuaries, solutions, or Disneylands? Oops. So the story of our planet 4 billion years old, has kind of become this kind of a co-evolved story between our planet and one species, us. Came out of Africa, the modern form, only like 50,000 years ago, and started to first just move around the planet, but then dominate world ecosystems, you know, and it's now grown to the point where we're one super organism that surrounds the planet in constant communication with each other, economic, commerce, in every way. No species like us has ever existed before. There's a dark side to us too, of course, that in our domination of ecosystems, we're still learning how to use our habitats, and we don't, there's different standards, and we're developing those standards as time goes by. You can see the shifting standards as time has gone by, to the point where now there's an ethic, and as Tim Flannery, the ecology, points out, we're probably at the point where we can actually do something effectively planetary, because we're at that point of domination that it's actually possible. And we've had a terrible impact on forests. And you can see a lot of that impact has happened in the last 50 years, demand and technology combining. And the story has been the same in the Hawaiian Islands, sadly, maybe even worse in terms of the degree of environmental displacement. So in the next slide, non-native habitats are shown in red, which I think for most local people it was certainly a shock for me as a young man, knowing that all the areas I hiked behind my house, there wasn't one single native plant. And that some local people who've lived there all their lives maybe have never even seen a native plant except at the beach. And then on Maui, all the bands of dry forest on the leeward side, all the yellow bands, gone, and mostly in 200 years. Kind of a phenomenal achievement, actually. Dark achievement, but an achievement nonetheless. From Aldo Leopold, I like this quote: "Our tools are better than we are. They grow faster than we do. They suffice to crack the atom, to command tides, but they do not suffice for the oldest task in human history, to live on a piece of land without spoiling it." And he wrote that a long time ago, but we're still discovering that. And that is a challenge of this generation, and probably the next couple of generations after this. These are the crucial generations. Because the big question is, can we change our ways? We've been field builders, and we're so good at it, communicating. And I mean, look what this species has done in a relatively short time. But can we change up our game? Bradshaw is an early pioneer of the subject of this talk, ecological restoration. And he writes, hey, the acid test of our understanding is not whether we can, write down pieces of paper and take ecosystems apart on paper, but whether we can do something in practice. So here's the picture on Maui, Haleakala National Park. And this fence is a course part of this restoration exercise. Can we bring back systems? Ecological restoration has many definitions. Each one of these has kind of their strength. I'm probably not going to go into all of them. Maybe you can read them at yourself. The one that I'm going to follow is the first one. Ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So those are all bad words, those D words: degraded, damaged, destroyed. Those are really bad words. So restoration is applied when you're using almost CPR. The next definition is mostly about the damage caused by humans. The next one is that we're going to try to go back in the past. And the last one is the one that we're going to try to compensate for alterations caused by humans. So they are versions of each other, but some of them represent an independent contribution. Ecological restoration now is like first flying balloons in the 1700s. People believed that if you rode a horse too fast, you could suffocate, and that anybody who was foolish enough to go up in a balloon would surely have a heart condition. And so there was all this fear at the first, and that's not dissimilar to us in ecological restoration. But just like balloons have turned into 767s, so does ecological restoration have to proceed if we're kind of to move forward as a species and kind of continue our co-evolution with this planet. The UN certainly got it. They named this the decade of ecological restoration, and basically kind of set down the gauntlet in a way that we had 10 years to do something. You always have more time than that, but 10 years to still operate and to do a really good job with the wild ecosystems that are left, and a pretty phenomenal statement by the United Nations. We all wouldn't be doing as well, wouldn't be as ahead of the game as we are without New Zealand. New Zealand has been a leader in ecological restoration, and they've kind of done it slow by slow. They started a little bit earlier in the 90s, and they started doing ecological restoration on offshore islands. It was so successful that they decided to move on to the mainland. And right behind this young man's head, you see Boundary Stream, mainland island. That's our first extension of it, is taking tracts of forest that were isolated and trying to do the same things that had been done on offshore islands on the mainland. And that started actually this whole mainland movement, which proceeded to predator-proof or predator-resistant fencing and major community projects like Karori or Zealandia, probably the largest conservation project in New Zealand, and a high interface with the public. Right next to a major neighborhood would be like being behind Wailuku or Honolulu. Or Mogotautari a little bit farther, but definitely always with the idea of not keeping nature reserves secret, letting the public see them, and understanding that public support is crucial for conservation projects. It's not an optional element, it's an essential element. And probably ecological restoration is slightly different in that way, is that it requires even more human involvement. So having places like, excuse me, cafeteria that overlook restoration areas. And the wealth of sanctuary or restoration projects in New Zealand, phenomenal. I would say it's a national heritage. To the point where they're now considering the idea of getting rid of it in whole districts and throughout the whole country. It's something that was, when I first heard it, I doubted it. And when I went down there and I saw the strategic, logical, science-based way they approached it, I would say that it's encouraging that humans can think that way, and maybe we can follow leaders like this to a better world. So what can we learn? The full incorporation of society into conservation efforts, community, private industry, and government give New Zealand projects uncommon vitality, community buy-in, and greatly improve the feasibility, whether projects get off the ground, and sustainability, how long they stay off the ground, how long they're operating. And in New Zealand, this is the second thing, restoration, ecology, and science are amazingly well integrated. Maybe a little bit more about that. I have a friend in New Zealand who always says if it wasn't replicated, it never happened, showing their really the co-reliance upon science and ecological restoration. So let me just read this. Science is an essential component if restoration is to continue to grow, to mature, to reach its potential. Without the scientific process, ecological restoration can be like having a knife fight in the dark. You might win and you might lose, but basically you don't know why. And without at least some science, probably even the more the better, you likely won't understand the process, and very likely you can't repeat it. But that said, outside of New Zealand, science is often absent from ecological restoration projects. Please don't be alarmed, everybody. Actionable, relevant science can and does exist. And to me, ecological restoration gives science the opportunity that science needs to prove itself as essential in the future. Science probably have a number of roles moving into the future. Ecological restoration is going to be one of the key ones, in my opinion. So please don't give up on your local scientists, and that includes me or grad students. Be kind to them. And this is probably the most important part. Help let them know that the community truly cares about the native resources that they're studying. Encourage them to examine their own science and ask themselves, is your science relevant to the grave situation that natural systems are in? Is your science actionable? It's probably a new standard that we need to apply. And probably science that doesn't ask these questions will be looked at as antiquated moving forward, and maybe self-indulgent. Bradshaw came up, moving off the science thing a little bit, into Bradshaw came up with these original sketches, which are meant to say, hey, look, it was an original ecosystem, often upper right, and we've kind of moved to a degraded form, and we want to move back toward that direction. So this graph has had conferences done on it, you know, basically. But important here is also this idea of replacements. I talk a little bit about it later. Every time you have a non-native that, or an extinction, and a non-native fits in, you move away from that original ecosystem. And at least in restoration projects, that's important. This is also a really good one where this vision, Richard Hobbs, and Kramer from Western Australia envisioned the progress from a fully functional ecosystem, in this case upper left to lower right, to be actually crossing a series of threshold events. It looks complicated, but it really isn't actually that complicated. The idea of a threshold event being like presence of grass, presence of ungulates, absence of pollinators, absence of dispersers, and biotic and abiotic thresholds of shade habitat available. But each one of these is a threshold you have to cross to get from degraded to fully functional. One thing that's important is the discipline is kind of growing super rapidly all around the world, organically. People all around the world are doing this. It's really important that we speak the same language. And I like to use the example of medicine. Medicine could not proceed, and it proceeds globally because we're all speaking the same language. But it cannot proceed without accepted universal definitions that facilitate improvements, to actually facilitate accurate communication. There's a Chinese expression, the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom begins by calling things by their correct names. So in Hawaii, we've been doing environmental protection for a long time, and restoration, not so much. And the difference, obviously, there's a continuum. It's not like a there, that, even though in this case, Kipahulu Valley on the left, putting up a fence is clearly an example of ecological protection. And Oahe on the right is clearly an example of ecological restoration. You know, but there are examples in between of Hawaii because there's such a range of environmental options being done. Restoration versus rehabilitation. And this is in the talk, the idea of what is a sanctuary versus what's a solution. And there's no value judgments here because to me, either one has validity. It kind of depends on the situation you're in. But the difference is a reference ecosystem. And a reference ecosystem is here a community of organisms that is able to act as a model or a benchmark for restoration. And that SER, that Society for Ecological Restoration, includes climate change as now a factor in developing reference ecosystems. This is acknowledgement of the importance of climate change. Is to say we're not just only about the past, guys. The past doesn't make any sense if it's inaccurate. As somebody said, it was always meant to be a guide, never a straitjacket. That might be a little bit harsh, but the idea that it's not meant to be unrealistic. It's meant to be adapted for climate change, but that's the difference. Restoration is a sanctuary and it's going after the past by using the reference ecosystems. So information sources that you can use to generate reference ecosystems. You know, I guess the most important thing here, you can read these, but is that reference ecosystems are not real places, or it's not one real place. It could be a series of places, but it's not actually meant to be one place that you're trying to copy. But you can use photographs and notes. I'll show you what I did for the Oahe project, or this is just a more graphic representation of things I used to construct a reference ecosystem for Oahe. And that's Joseph Rock in the background from indigenous trees, his descriptions of Oahe. It's actually some of the only ecological descriptions that have ever been published. Field surveys, lower left and upper left. And area photographs were really actually important in sketching out where the big tree clusters have been and still are. And then in upper right, the black and white photographs were really important. I think Joseph Rock would be surprised that I wasn't as interested in the foreground tree, that he probably took great pains to pick the foreground tree, but I'm actually interested in the background, the density of the trees. There's a lot of non-natives in the foreground, but I see ferns and grasses and different things that have really been functional in what we do at Oahe. Reference ecosystem. From the Yogi Berra Code, and this is in regards to reference ecosystems and restoration, ecological restoration projects. You got to be careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. So reference ecosystems in a Hawaiian setting, why Hawaii is fortunate. And I never realized this until I started communicating with Australians, for example. But unlike many places in the world, a realistic understanding of the likely pre-human environmental condition is often very possible in Hawaii, because it's only been 1,000 or 1,500 years that people have been here. It's a long time, but it's not as long as humans have occupied some parts of the world. Like in many places in Europe and in Australia, human occupancy is exceeding 40, 50,000 years. So we don't have any prehistory of that time. So we wouldn't even know what a reference ecosystem would be accurately. And so in some of those areas, they're using the term intervention instead of restoration. Here in Hawaii, we clearly have restoration in my mind, because we are going after reference ecosystems. We are trying to restore the past as much as possible, acknowledging that we have extinctions, acknowledging that we're in an era of climate change. But that's something that you have to understand going into Hawaii, is that probably, I think it's the vulnerability, probably what I wrote here, perhaps more than any other place on the planet, in Hawaii, non-native invasive species have the potential to profoundly disturb the best laid of restoration plans. And the growth of invasive species, unchecked by the absence of co-evolved predators and pathogens, you know this, enemy release, has the potential to profoundly and perhaps irrevocably disturb the restoration trajectory in the Hawaiian Islands. So it just means almost anything's fair in the Hawaiian Islands. You might start something, start a restoration project, and in some cases might even have to abandon it because there's an invasive species that thrives in the protection that you've given it. And so that's actually a scenario I can envision. It just means that in Hawaii, almost more than any other place on the planet, our biota is vulnerable. We have a spectacular biota, but it is not adapted for some of the type of foreign influences that come globally and have now become established in Hawaii. Black rats, Argentine ants, some of the worst invasive plants on the island, I mean in the world. So the Hawaii biota is besieged. I mean, that's the reason why we have ecological restoration projects as such a high, I believe there's such a high priority in Hawaii, because this is the last generation that's going to be able to do anything about it. So part of the Society for Ecological Restoration stress is that, you know, I love Hawaiian species and I want to protect species, but there is a thought here, hey, we're not trying to make hard to get to botanical gardens. We're trying to protect the trajectories of places, the ecological trajectories. And right here it is, because this is Hawaii. Because the goal is a functioning native system, not a hard to get to botanical garden. If it was a hard to get to botanical garden, one, it wouldn't make much sense because people would have a hard time getting to it. But two, it would take a lot of work. Functioning native systems develop their own set of protective biotic resistance being one of them. Biotic resistance is the reduction in invasion success caused by the native community through competition, herbivory, and other pathogens. The biotic resistance hypothesis predicts that diverse native communities are more resistant to invasion. That means the richer your native ecosystem, the more it has the ability to repel invaders, especially plant invaders. It's the native forest equivalent of, I hear you knocking, but you can't come in. It's just that native plants, non-native plants can be right outside the boundaries, but they cannot get established because of the strength of the ecological community, which, to be honest, from a cultural perspective, or even just hearing Hawaiian forests have been weak for all these years, gives me a type of pleasure that areas like this, they're not weed proof, okay? But they are very weed resistant because of the reassemblage of native plants of different guilds. So that's this whole idea of having ecological processes and species trajectories work for you in a restoration process. It's that if you're doing a weeding project or a kind of a gardening project in the woods, very easy to lose control of it because of all the work that's required. But when you do strategic actions, strategic plannings in choreographed ways, you can create conditions and assemble components where the work of the restoration is carried out by the biota itself. It's not just words. It actually allows you to do larger and larger areas. You know, it's a delicate thing because you are depending upon the species, and because you're depending upon the species, I'll be honest, climate change can upset the cart because climate change changes the rules. But so far, we've done a really good job, at least at Oahe, and I know it's possible in other sites. So when you're doing this idea of reintroducing plants, there's a concept out there, it came from Funk, great name, by the way, concept of limiting similarity. So it's just this idea that when you're putting in things, two little concepts here. One, you select native species that are likely to compete with and exclude invasive species. And the second one is that you choose native species that are ecologically similar to problematic invaders. Okay, and that's the first one, likely to compete and with exclude. I actually think that's one is the one that should be dissimilar. Okay, plants that are dissimilar to each other. So, for example, a'ali'i is very dissimilar. So the rule was limiting similarity, which is just a backwards way of saying of picking a dissimilar species. So a'ali'i over here is a really good match with ule over here. One is erect, thin branch, rapid growing. The other one is slow growing, more laterally branched, much stronger branches. I have a little saying I used to use, no way without ule. And that is actually really true in that a'ali'i grows fast, but ule comes underneath, and the combination of them is much more effective than either one. And then the other idea is like mimicking weedier species. So palapalai, and you have to forgive me, oh the god, the palapalai, for comparing you to a weedy species. But palapalai occurs in a thick mat in the lower light of a forest, and that is a weed niche. And mamaki for a different reason, only because it's so rapid growing and it loves light, and so it fills into spaces, really growing rapidly. In a way, it's like it is a native successional plant, which we could call a weed if it were in that type of setting. It has a native plant, it's just a rapid successional, but it has those characteristics where it could actually fight with weeds, whereas other species don't stand a chance just because of slower growth rates. Moving topics a little bit is how long does it take for forests to recover? I won't go into this too much. Every forest, if you look over at the green one off on the far right, it says forest. You look over the bars, it says mean is somewhere around 40 years and come up to 50 years. It's interesting how I've heard this from several people, and not just from this study, about the 40, 50-year period before functionality. And we have, structural forest resemblance at 10 years at Hawaii. But I can really see that it would take another several decades for the trees, if we continue on these trajectories, to establish enough that they'll start to lock up canopies and take us to the level that's being predicted here, should everything go well. So I talked about the importance of a no reference ecosystem. We have to be going for the past, but I say no reference ecosystem, no cry. And this is something I really believe in, is that ecological rehabilitation, right? I'm an ecological restoration guy, because right now there are native habitats that they're the last of them that need saving. But ecological rehabilitation is a discipline of healing damaged lands, and for the good of people, lands that maybe are wastelands or used for other purposes now, where they could be used really for the benefit of society, some aspect of it, economically, culturally, socially, just something. But they're likely to grow dramatically in the next few decades. And so the burgeoning role of rehabilitation in a changing role. A really good example would be stopping sedimentation. It's enormous. It's staggering how many tons of sediment leave each of these main islands, and especially Maui, Molokai are the ones I'm most familiar with, where the ocean bleeds red after big rains, and so it's almost embarrassing, if you ask me. It's almost like a national embarrassment, and it's a tragedy to lose our topsoils and to have them kill our reefs. It's certainly something that warrants some type of, and I know I don't mean to minimize the efforts that are now being going on, because it deserves attention to the rehabilitation project. And those goals can be combined with other things. One of the ultimate rehabilitation projects I think could happen is that of our watersheds, native watersheds. Almost all our water comes from our northern forests. Our northern forests are made up of mostly, let me just read it here, montane rainforests, native rainforests of Hawaii, our watershed forests are among the least degraded. That was the green belt in the vegetation thing, but the most vulnerable of all native Hawaiian ecosystems. And unlike nearly all of the tropical forests in the world, native forests of windward slopes of the Hawaiian Islands are dominated by a single tree, Ohi'elehua, Metrosideros, a beautiful tree, a kinolau of Pele, just an amazing tree. And growing up with it, I never really questioned the fact that there was mostly these trees are filled with, our forests are filled with only one tree. But hiking in places of the world, around the world, I realized that, some forests, Hawaii has 40 something, 50 native tree species. And there are trees below, the koa goes above it, but the bulk, 90% of the trees in the lehua forest are lehua. That is good and bad. The dominance of a single tree species in these forests makes you really vulnerable to some species-specific perturbation. That's something that comes in after you. Something comes in after Metrosideros, and the whole house falls over. Whereas if in a place like Oahe, only one tree species goes out, the forest lives on. It's like in that chart, it's like a replacement. It moves away, but it's alive. Whereas the forest like this goes into something that Simberloff called invasional meltdown. It gets such a blow up in canopy, light fills up, and weeds from the tropics do what they do best, which is they react to light gap situations, except you're dealing with light gaps that are miles across. So it's almost ecological confusion in a way, but ecological invasional meltdown probably somewhat does it justice. This is a lehua mass flowering in Bakakipahulu. It also has weed problems. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that our watershed forests are vulnerable. They already have problems. This is kahili or Himalayan ginger infestation in Upper Hana. All these other weeds. There's 11 here that could easily be a dirty dozen or 15 of serious habitat modifying invasive plants that are somewhere in the forests of the Hawaiian Islands, wet forests, and are moving around. So at some point right now, Hawaiian forests, and we have Rapidoheadus. So right now, our windward forests are not only our watershed forests, but they're sanctuary forests for our Hawaiian birds and for so many of our endemic plant species. And I regret the day would ever happen, of course, but there may come a day when we would move that from a sanctuary forest, to a solution forest, that we would try to tend it best for watershed activities. Some future generation is going to have to come up with the best ways to do that, and then maybe shrink the biological protection areas down to what in the Park Service has been called special ecological areas. But it is a drawback scenario, and it's a loss scenario, but it's actually trying to make the best of a bad situation, and actually trying not to lose water resources for the future in case there's a collapse of a community, of a biological community. Dark thoughts, but they're thoughts that you probably need to consider ahead of time. One thing that's really in our favor is that we really have an amazing public agency, County of Maui Water Supply. I don't say that emptily. I think most government agencies are reacting to situations, as they occur or even after they occur. I see the County of Maui as intellectually interested in these issues, intellectually interested in them because they're interested in knowing the terrain that's ahead of them so that they can do the best planning they can. And I'm impressed with that. And from, you would consider county the lowest level of organization of government, to be honest. I mean, the county, state, federal, I think they're exemplary in the levels of planning that they bring. And I'm proud to have them representing me on Maui. Okay, so some of what happens with all these non-native species that I've been mentioning is that they unite in ways to form what one of my heroes, Richard Hobbs, calls the new ecological world order, novel ecosystems. So just jumping to the bottom, or I'll just tell you what novel ecosystems are. Novel ecosystems are places where the native biota has been scrubbed clean, and introduced species from different parts of the world now occupy. They don't know each other, birds from Asia, plants from Brazil, and they form ad hoc relationships. Novel communities, novel ecosystems. And then at the bottom, they lack natural analogs, and they now occupy more than 3/4 of wild Earth. So on those pictures of the Hawaiian Islands in red, with the non-native species, those are novel ecosystems. Okay, a little bit about Disneyland and from the title. So this is the take-home message. It's not what you do, but it's what you claim you're doing that gains you entry into the Magic Kingdom, Disneyland. Okay, so and it goes back to reference ecosystems. In true restoration project, the ancestral evolutionary path of each individual site is attempted to be honored and, to the extent possible and feasible, restored into the modern world. And to me, this is analogous to the respect and consideration given when repairing, quote unquote, ancient archaeological sites such as Hawaiian Heiau. You're not kind of free to do what you want to do, at least if you're going to call it a portion of the past. If you're going to call it restoration, you have to be based on the past. Now, I think even just a few years ago, nobody cared. But now, just like with a community of medical doctors, there's terms that are being developed, and restoration means that you know where you're going, not that you're wandering down the place. And so I really think of it, I would say, like, don't even restore an archaeological site unless you know what you're doing. And I'd say the same thing is true with a community. You can do whatever you want, of course, if you don't call it restoration. If you call it rehabilitation, you can do whatever you want. You know, of course, you can do whatever you want whatever you want to begin with. But I would say that this idea of honoring the past and treating the past as almost as an archaeological thing, as a sense of sacred, like we don't have much of it left, guys. So what we do have to have left, we have to keep that pattern alive, that genetic and the community pattern. You can't just mix things. So I think that matches the indigenous perspective. So the indigenous cosmological perspective appears to be a good match with adherence to the reference ecosystem model. That is, it treats the past and each of its components as sacred, as something essential to the perpetuation of a living culture. You don't go mix and match. And to the extent possible, you do everything to maintain their existence as living entities. So here's my distinguishing characteristics for Disneyland projects. They don't have a reference ecosystem, and yet you calling yourself a restoration project. There's a focus on planting favorite species. I'm guilty of that too, so that's probably not a good one. But tendency to plant what's available, that green is good. And you see this a lot, that actually goes down a little bit farther with mixing native and non-native species. Or no concern for honoring the original ancestral regional native genetics, i.e. buying plants from Home Depot. And this is akin to planting what's available, which I think is a dangerous tendency. You know, it can be that, oh yeah, Naupaka was available, so we planted Naupaka. Oh, and this week we planted A'ali'i. You know, and I mean, I don't think any of us here would confuse that with restoration projects, but people are saying things like that. Definitely mixing native and non-native species suggests that you have a myopic view of where you're headed. Certainly if you're using the past as any kind of judgment. And basically you are making hard to reach botanical gardens, which probably will not have biotic resistance to protect them. They might develop into a thatch that might protect themselves, but probably they're also going to be hard to maintain, to be honest, unless they're right next to your house. I hope that's enough about Disneyland. It wasn't meant to be too harsh of a comment, but it is meant to kind of hone people and maybe compare it to archaeological sites that, hey, get with it, you know. And if you're going to call yourself a restoration ecosystem, then you need to pass a couple of criteria. Okay, how can we get better as individuals and as a society of restoration biologists and practitioners? Okay, my pitch is going to be, if you're interested in ecological restoration, to first of all get involved with the Society for Ecological Restoration. It's free at first, and then with just minimum cost ownership, the registration fees, you're going to be able to access all their programs, which are amazing. And some of the courses are really super, as well as all these lectures that have been recorded from all these subjects around the world. God, you could pretty much spend all your time, at least for a bit, becoming an expert, you know. And when you want to become certified, there's this CERP program, Certified Ecological Restoration Practitioner. You have to have some chops to do it. Project you've been associated with in coursework, but it's definitely something worth pursuing. It's a stamp by SER that, yes, you know what you're doing. I'm a CERP, despite my chaotic state of knowledge. The SER made a mistake and granted me CERP status, as well as Erica von Alman, also from our group. When we became CERPs, I think I was the first one from Hawaii. When we became CERPs, there were like 200. Now there's like 500, and I think they're really, I would call that rapid growth and almost creds given to it internationally is showing why it's growing, is because SER is assuming a leadership role in restoration and helping to define words, helping us work together to define words, to advance this as a group, and then to also maybe kind of make sure that we all know what we're talking about. And so the CERP program is something I think we should have more CERP people in Hawaii. We need them. We definitely need them, and it would be a wonderful goal. So what do ecological restoration projects most often need? Okay, these are requirements which play to the skills of the green industry. If you're in the green industry, first of all, I guess, what can the green industry do? Well, these are things that we need, and these are things you do well. Produce large numbers of plants, often on schedule, okay? Then these should be clean of weed seeds and pathogens. Develop and implement dibble and other plant container technology. And then genetic considerations, keeping seeds separate. Landscaping with native species and mixing with ecological restoration projects. I think this is something that it's a crossover move. At first, the idea of landscaping, even using landscaping as seed sources, and I'll talk about that in a second. But then mixing them with ecological restoration projects in creative ways. Basically hybrid forms. I just think it's creative. So just because you have one site means you could have several different areas of it. And one thing I said about the planting goes with this, which is this idea of within the next whatever decade, stopping the wild collection of seed, at least from some species where we don't really need to. Maybe for specialized one, but for some species, we'd be much better off with seed farms. We'd be much better off because one, you wouldn't be ripping off native environments, and two, you'd probably be getting seeds that were outcrossed versus selfed, because many plants today are selfed, depending on the situation. But if they're selfed, if they're not really being outcrossed, they don't really probably have the full genetic complement that you would expect from wild. You might be able to generate better genetic diversity from seed farms in some cases, and that's almost sad than you can from wild seed sources. And this is definitely what the green industry does well, and we're always looking for partners to work with, because we have our seeds and we need this. This is the next step. It's almost a baton race, getting genetically appropriate seeds to a grower who grows them in really clean conditions and then get us back to them in quick order. That's the baton race that if there's no lag in it is perfection. I wanted to mention something about the potential for ecological restoration and rehabilitation along Hawaiian coastlines. I'm involved with dry forest, but if I wasn't, I'd be more involved with Hawaiian coastal ecosystems. I think they're got a lot of things going for them. This is Mo'omomi on Molokai, and some of the staff from TNC on Molokai, Wailana, and some other people, and myself. But this is us at Mo'omomi, and so advantages of coastal ecosystems. They have salt on them, and salt is poison mostly for plants, but coastal plants are tolerant of it. And so because they are, it's not a very weedy ecosystem. The weeds that invade have to be tolerant of salt too. So salt is a real advantage because it keeps these areas. You can see the limit of salt up there is pretty much the limit of native plants as salt is blown up, And then the other thing is it's close to people's homes. And there's many, many different species that are really important to the Hawaiian culture and biologically special. You have Aki grants in the foreground. It's a species that if I was working in ecological restoration projects, I would be trying to work with. I think it's a potential ecological tool for ecological restoration projects. And it also has its super rare plants. I mean, how many people have seen the native popolo, the coastal popolo, Solanum nelsoni, like almost looking like a naupaka. There's naupaka. I've seen that already. No, the naupaka is in the back, and in the foreground is this kind of like fuzzy wuzzy little plant with purple flowers, like that, almost like eggplanty little flowers. It's in the same family, tomato family, but super rare, and once probably calm and all Molokai, all Kahalui Harbor, it's probably choke pre-contact days. And the coastal ecosystem also has a lot of water feeders, water features from ankling ponds to stream mouths that I think many of them, sometimes they almost become like, sewer places, but I just think that they can be, every place should take care of its water sources, and they make excellent restoration projects. And I think it's just like Oahe. If you start doing something, somebody will jump in and help you. The leeward. Let's jump over to the leeward. And this quote from Ralph Hosmer. The leeward makes an excellent restoration project, or an excellent source restoration project, but some of that is because it's tragic. So much of it is gone. Probably about 2% of dryland forest. So prior to about 25 years ago, 1887, there was a belt of heavy forest with dense undergrowth in the Kula district. 1887, dense forest in Kula, 3,500 to 3,000. That's about the last houses up on Haleakala. That's oops. and then immediately above the corn belt. So yeah, kind of amazing to think the forest of Kula. Some people have called the forest of Kula one of the richest forests that existed in the Hawaiian Islands, and there was one report that called it the epicenter of extinction in Hawaii. One thing about Hawaii that's really sad is probably that these were the most, at least in some areas, probably some of the most productive of forests. And so we'll never experience the birds that were there. We know from lava tubes that this is a representation of birds that we know are at Hawaii. Not all of them are the exact species. Some of them are analog species, but when you put them all together, this is pretty much the bird biota. And I guess I have a world premiere here is that we try to throw all the sounds from these birds together, the songs and calls from these birds together to give you a little vignette of what Hawaii must have been like before. So a little bit of a takeaway from ecological restoration, but check out Oahe in the pre-context. So if we were at Oahe, or even in Pukalani or a place like that 1,000 years ago, what would it sound like? Okay. I'm not sure what to say about that because I mean it's obviously not entirely realistic, but when you start to, because of birds don't, but when you start to hear that that's probably they were calling in groups like that, it's staggering. And from an ecological restoration perspective, you realize that you're not going to be able to get back all the way, that you have had replacement, that we've lost so much on leeward systems, and yet systems are resilient. That's probably what we're discovering now, is that systems are resilient. They are a little forgiving. Dry forests, Hawaiian dry forests were famous for their ethnobotanical uses. They're some of the most productive forests. So there were the things that Hawaiians used came from medicine, tool making, canoe building, house building, weapons, fishing, dyes, religious. Probably there's no other ecosystem in Hawaii that was as important to Hawaiians as dry forest. And to me, that also makes it an excellent target for restoration. Culturally, it's important to people. We care. Two people for which Oahe is really responsible. We're working with Oahe's restoration now. Without these two men, nothing would have happened. And that's Joseph Rock, the first biologist who kind of noted the area and called it the finest forest with pu'uwa'uwa in the Hawaiian Islands. And then his guide, William Keiokumalie, who at the time was Hawaiian cowboy and botanist. The stories about how he used to have arguments with his son about how many mahoi trees were left, because they're one of the very few Hawaiian botanists at that time that really knew the name of almost every tree in the forest. And it was William's discussion with Joseph Rock, and back and forth that actually created awareness in William of the forest that he transmitted to the owners. And so when I came about, many years later, the ranch had already been sensitized to this is a special forest and you are stewards. So when I came, the way was paved in a way for us to do good things. But I don't want to not honor these men in the past. And I work with the relatives of this man, and I'm honored to work with the relatives of this man on the right, William Keiokumalie. So a little bit more about that later. Oahe Forest, you can see it fading. It's basically an ecological free fall. This is 1950. If you look at that patch of grass down below, the big open, you can kind of trace the forest, but the fading of the forest. In 1965, between these 2 years is when Kikuyu was introduced, and then you really see the impact on forest trees, the death in certain areas, especially in certain parts of the forest trees. You can see the forest is fading away, turning into a pasture. There it is, Kikuyu. This is the wild form, so it doesn't really have seeds. So this is Dr. Lamoureux's picture from 1960, which at that time it was still thought to be a tragic forest diversity. But there was a lot of difference between when Dr. Lamoureux was there in the 60s and when I got there later on. This is pretty bleak. I would have to say, but this is actually when the restoration project comes in, it's like, this is the last hope, the last chance. So what we discovered, project started over 20 years ago in 1997, and I would say is that people really care. From the very beginning, I had no idea anybody would ever come out. And we've never, ever, during all those years, had trouble filling seats. We've never, ever had people that weren't interested. Well, maybe they weren't, but I never really saw them, to be honest. I've been amazed at how many people really, really care to how many people come time after time or want to come time after time, but we have to turn them down because we want to get other people. The technique is to use, we do use herbicide, we use it once, because that was the idea, is trying not to use herbicide. We use it once to get rid of the kikuyu. So get rid of the mats and then wait for it to become kind of a grass mat, and then plant in the first wave. You're going to have second waves and third waves come in. Here's our little methodology. You spray once, 3 to 6 weeks, you plant a plant per square meter. As time goes by, you add the shrub, tree, and fern outplantings. You eliminate problematic invaders. You let the rest go. We don't have time for them, and we couldn't do it anyhow. And you involve the community. And that's probably the most important one. So the community really cares about what's happening with the forest. In today's world, that's probably the most important thing, is that humans really care. We use OOs modeled after actually Kamakao's notes and some of the original plantings about the importance of the OO in cultural plantings. But people are the backbone of what we do. And once again, they provide amazement to me because there's so many different types of people. And we're at the point right now, we're kind of like, we're cruising on, we have a lot of momentum in that it just seems like we have a lot of good energy and a lot of good people come to us. So we are a low technique. We achieve dramatic changes. You suppress it with herbicide the first time, but it doesn't come back. That's the really cool thing, and you suppress it with native shrubs, and leaf litter comes up. So it's like a jump start. It's like CPR or something, you're jump starting the patient. Is the patient alive and healthy yet? Nope. Is he on his feet? Yep. And so this is 20 years of work there. But we have small crews, so we can't afford to garden. We kind of like aim, as we say, we use the plants. Without the plants working for us, we wouldn't be able to achieve this type of success. Pretty amazing, actually. And then this question that we asked ourselves when we work with some USGS colleagues, but does forest restoration assist in repairing aquifers? Well, it's kind of a big deal. If we can bring back the forest, do we bring back the aquifers? So we got experimental irrigation systems. We put them inside and outside. There were a bunch of them. I think there were 6 or something like that, 6 or 8. And then we replicated Kona storms. And we saw, does the water go to the aquifer or does it not go to the aquifer? Who knew what was going to happen? This is only a few decades old. So even the hydrologists were saying there's probably not going to be any difference, There was a lot of difference, okay? Even young restored forest, the water goes quickly down, whereas in the grasses, it's blocked, actually. The grass provides almost like a chemical, or there's a barrier there, like kikuyu grass, that it takes a while to break down for waters to penetrate, actually. The soil can be quite dry right underneath. And a couple of publications came out of it. And just the system itself. But for me, achieving this type of thing is, green cover, that's great. But until you start to feel a heartbeat, the patient is not living. And the heartbeat is the germination of native seedlings naturally, not things you plant, things that come up. And so these are things that have come up inside the enclosures over the last 20 years or so, some of them in great abundance. The ones in yellow are plants that I've never seen anywhere but in the enclosures. And in many cases, there's more keiki, more seedlings inside the enclosure, which is like 30 acres, 20, 30, 40 acres, like 40 acres. There's more seedlings in the 40 acres than there is in the rest of Maui County. Here are Olopua seedlings. And this is in a way, if this isn't everywhere, this isn't every Olopua tree. This is an example of a real happy Olopua tree. It's also actually an example of a lack of seed dispersal. See, because if there were native crows, they would have been distributing these seeds around elsewhere. But it's still a sign of ecosystem functionality. Or ala'a, oh, this is a Nestegis, Olopua Nestegis, Oleaceae. This is Sapotaceae, ala'a, Puteria. This is one of the plants that's used for kapa anvils. It makes a really resonant wood. It would probably make good ukuleles. Papala. Papala is a really rare plant. So to see a keiki of it, a natural keiki of it, is rare. So for a botanist, this is kind of a wow. When's the last time I saw one of those? At least for me at Hawaii. And then jalapepe with the little keiki looking almost like grass over on the right-hand side. And what many people often ask about, sandalwood. This one being the Haleakala sandalwood, the keiki over on the left. And keiki took 10 years, 15 years before we started to see keiki in the enclosures of keiki is my name for seedlings, natural seedlings of iliahi in the enclosures. It's an endangered species too. And say another endangered species, aiea, name for aiea on Oahu, but this one on Maui, and many more trees on Maui than there are on Oahu. And so this is one that after we got rid of rats, we had whole cohorts of seedlings come up. Sometimes a rare plant gives you an opportunity to do something cool with people. So you get to do that double thing where you have a super rare plant. It's a plant I rediscovered, the 30 wild plants around. We work with Anna Palomino, our gifted propagation people. And sometimes we come up with a keiki. One of the best things that we all enjoy doing is giving that keiki to somebody who's earned the right to plant it and telling them how special it is and how special they are for planting it, and kind of standing back and letting the event happen. And just making sure that everything's good, but other than that, letting their energy be the energy that, I've told people that I've seen the view from the front seat enough in my career. I actually get a thrill from showing the view to somebody, and it's an honor to show the view. Once you show the view, you don't know what you're going to start. So another plant is the hole. Here's beautiful seeds. It's a plumeria relative. That's a whole canopy of them. And we plant in dibbles like this, various sizes. And here's our seeds. So this is a seed gathering expedition. Pilo, kolea, ule. This will be a typical seed collecting day. And then send them to our growers. Then they come back to us. Down below, jalapepe, kolea, ai, ule, and then a rack of kawila in the back. And the exciting part when they're going back home to be released. They talk about releasing animals. Well, we release plants. Yes, we have to plant them, but it's like releasing them back into the wild. That's where they came from, and that's where they're returning. So what I've discovered in my career is that mostly people really care. And most people have a hero in them. Most people want to be a hero. They want to earn the right to be a hero. They want to actually do it. And yeah, it's been an honor to sail with crews like this, to be honest. I think it brings out something special in people. I think when you're walking around Kahului, I don't know, people don't really seem to sometimes emote to each other as much. Sometimes it's almost as if you live in an individual world. But when we go up at Oahu, people who don't know each other start talking, and by the end of the day, they're friends. I mean, they're not little friends. They're big, shake big hands, hey bro, see you around friends. I see it happen all the time. When it happened the first time, I was thinking, oh, we're lucky. But I have this little expression that I use where no one ever helped the mountain as much as the mountain helped them. The mountain gives back something to people in groups. It actually makes people beautiful. People glow with a kind of a special energy. You remember the young man in the photograph, the William Keokomalie? He was in his 20s back then, when he was that young Hawaiian cowboy posing under the tree. What was that, 100 years ago now? So this is his great-grandson, Ainoa, and his daughter, a great-granddaughter, Kala'au, which means the plant, and him guiding her into planting an aiea at Oahu. She's been involved with Oahu since the beginning. You can see from how much changes she's gone through. And this is one of the first exposure. But she's still there. This was a couple months ago. And so, well, I would only think about her as I would say that it's a joy to see people like this, whose legacy goes so deep into the forest, be able to maintain their relationship with the forest in 2021. You know, we're aware that to be honest, that people's relationship with nature is really important. And so that's something I've fostered, right? We're not just there to be slave workers, because if we were, there wouldn't we wouldn't get what we all need, you know, as Jeff Park says, you know, rediscovery isn't not enough. It's going to have to be preceded by reenchantment. So I like to have an artist come along, or I like to see art happening in all its forms. You know, this is incredible art that actually happened during a volunteer trip. You know, or what happens, you know, on some of our outreach events where we try to connect local kids with kind of little aspects of lehuas. Like, have you ever tasted a lehua flower? Is there any difference in the taste of the nectar between the red and the yellow ones? And guess what? Yes, there is, they taught me. Two more formal art projects where we're involved with, we were lucky enough to be involved with the No'e'ao, and did an art show with the Mexican graffiti artist Mazat, who is gifted, okay? We told him about the Hawaiian forest, and he just had empathy with it from his experience, his life experiences. And I mean, look at the alala on the left side with the Hawaiian in it, trying to fight back against rats. Anyhow, so it was quite a beautiful show. And I do think that this is the way that people in nature get revitalized and reconnected. Paul Simon was somebody, the musician, who was somebody who helped with that. He's a generous and kind, and we all probably know that from listening to his songs, but he's generous and kind to us because he took note of the Wahi project, a little baby project, and wanted to do something real, wanted to protect another patch of forest, didn't want to see his name attached to it, just wanted to see it be done. And so, you know, he gave us proceeds of his 2019 concert, and we're working on it. COVID has slowed us down a little bit, but the area in that white is slated for the fence that Paul Simon and his family helped us get together. So a little bit about our project. Probably the thing that I'm most happy about is 24 years. My goodness, it's a long time. Most projects haven't been around for that long, and that we're still really doing good work. We planted out a lot of plants. It's really a joy to see some of the plants that we're having out have babies themselves. So I call that babies having babies. I'm proud of our genetic thing, is that we've tried to treat Oahe like a temple. That the seeds for propagating seedlings have all come in within a mile of the exclosure. So we feel that we've kind of been the good agent that has helped, you know, Oahe, but we haven't gotten in the way too much, at least. A lot of people support us, and we're stoked for that, to have that kind of affiliations and people that contribute more than just good thoughts. We're a small project, and so this is lifeblood here. We wouldn't even have a project if it wasn't for the Erdman family, because these are national park resources that are in the middle of a working cattle ranch. So most ranchers would say, thank you for the information. You can leave a pamphlet at the front door. Thank you for coming. The Erdmans asked, what can we do? And they give us some of their most productive ranch lands to work with us, and have started to donate monies because they want the right, purely because they want the right thing to happen. So without Father Party, Son Sumner, and the rest of the family, no forest restoration would have ever occurred at Hawaii. So we all owe them our thanks. I do. And once again, the kala'au, and I've used this expression before, but I'm always amazed at it. Actually, is that we don't actually know what we do we don't know the full effect of all the things that we do in our life, you know. And so sometimes it's the people that we leave that can be the greatest of influences, you know. And so I don't want to make any predictions about Kala'au, except to say that she's a beautiful person who's been raised with the forest and with deep respect for it, and kind of completely in a sense of cultural continuity. And so malia pahak he kiuno paaka pohakunui awale ka. Perhaps it is a small stone that can keep the big rock from rolling down. So my final thoughts are, when I was a young man, I didn't even know what the word ecological restoration was. I just saw a forest in trouble. And I talked to a landowner and he said, let's go for it. And that was the birth of the project. And people at the time told me not to even do it. So I guess that's what I try to tell people is there's always a moment in a project where you have to determine whether you're going to jump or not. And I would say life is short. And that if you feel it's the right thing to do, if you feel like you're defending Hawaii, maybe you're doing the right thing, even if you have an ecological angle, like I understand this system, I can turn this around, or at least I want to learn how to turn it around. You know, Hawaii is in its last, you know, I don't think future generations are going to look back at us and say that we tried too much. Everything we do will produce a reward or not, but you know, I'm one that says this is the time for action. And if I've told people, you know, I don't know if we're going to be fools or prophets, but I would much rather try and fail than never have tried and have to tell myself a story about why it wouldn't have worked if I had tried. So I like trying. In fact, the New Zealanders very much echoed those thoughts, is that you have to try and you have to keep on trying. You don't just try once. And so I really want to thank CTAR and Hannah and Havilah and the other really good people who gave me the opportunity to talk about a really important topic that I think is only going to grow. And if it grows, then humans have a chance to get through the world with a better life than we could have otherwise, you know, hoped for. So thank you very much for your attention. You take care.
Hello, Art. Thank you so much for the inspiring, incredible presentation. We do have a few. I'd like to open it up to question and answers. We had a plethora of great comments. I'll start with the first one from Tim Park. Tim Park from Wellington, New Zealand here. Fantastic presentation. Thank you. This presentation was suggested to me by Eventbrite and was humbled at your comments about the work happening in New Zealand in Wellington. I manage Otari Native Botanic Garden and Wilton Forest Reserve in Wellington, and that was me in the slide you talked about, predator-free Wellington. I am keen to share stories about our work in strengthening connections and capacity of Indigenous restoration practitioners across New Zealand and the Pacific. Wilton Forest Reserve is a reference site for ecological restoration. It is the largest area of old growth forest in Wellington City and a few kilometers downstream from Zealandia. The restoration of this area has been led by local communities and is now an exemplar. I like your comments about ecological trajectories and tipping points. We use the same language. My question is, how do we translate these lessons for application and adaptation across the Pacific, ideally led by the Indigenous people?
Would you like me to try that?
Yes, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah, first of all, I'll just say that Tim is a hero of mine and his father is a hero of mine. His father, Jeff Clark, and was really an important figure that is why I'm here today. So from Maui, we're going to say aloha to Tim and thank you for honoring us with your presence. And they do incredible work down in Wellington. I think the question is the kind of the question of the next century is how to get Indigenous people involved, you know, especially all across the Pacific. I heard that Jean-Yves was here, Mayer from Tahiti. I almost threw in slides from a project that he's working with, Maruatea and the Punaru'u project in Tahiti. And there I saw a project that was run. I would say that the neat thing about it was that it was the organic part of it. All the infrastructure was run by Native people, because Native people is a funny word, but Tahitians is for their valley. And so I think that's the good news for me, is that people all across the Pacific, well, they're land people and they've been disenfranchised from the lands in many cases. And I think for me, that whole thing about being a hero, I think Indigenous people across the Pacific are kind of poised to be heroes again and to kind of reassume roles. I felt it here in Hawaii. I feel it in Tahiti and other places. They're looking for a role. And that role, if that role is saving the forests of these areas, I think that's really important. So, Tim, I would, I think you know the answer already, but I think it is empowerment. I think it's empowerment, and encouragement, but basically it is trying to show and then to let what's happening organically. But Jean-Yves could probably answer that as well as anybody because he's actually achieved it. So that would probably be my answer, is that the great thing is that there's such tremendous potential in it. Let me also just say something else about a group that has potential, and it's really it's a right turn from this, but I didn't want to not mention it. It's the role of women. When I first got involved with science, it just seemed that there were all men involved and all older men. And I'm really thrilled that ecological restoration, I think in the last SER conference I went to, there were more women than men. And maybe it's because of the compassionate, I'm not sure what difference is. Maybe it's because it's more involved, more quote unquote practical. Maybe it's because you see better things. But I think that women have a profound role in the future in ecological restoration, as do Indigenous people. So that would probably be my answer, is empowerment and moving and getting examples so that people can see Indigenous people in leadership roles, so that people can see women in leadership roles. I think that would help a lot for me. End of question.
Great. Thanks, Art and Tim. Thank you so much for attending, Tim. We have another question for you, Art. This is from Emily Pari. Sorry if I pronounced your last name wrong. What are your thoughts about analog forestry coming out of Sri Lanka, but applied widely throughout Central America and adapted to Southeast Asian ecosystems as an accelerating strategy for ecosystem restoration and for regeneration approaches through climate-adapted TEK and diverse eco-cultural approaches to permaculture/food forests? What strategies seem more viable to you for Hawaiian Island ecosystem restoration or regeneration? Bridging Hawaiian traditional Malama Aina and Vai systems with specific climate-adaptive technologies. Very interested to gain your insights on bridging traditional ecological Malama systems with climate-adaptive strategies. Great question.
It is a great question. And I'm not even sure I can honor it with as great an answer, because I do think that that's pioneer territory, and that's where we're going to be really pioneering. I do think that, it might be moving to something that I feel strongly about, but something about the coast. I think that with climate change in the coast, I think there is an opportunity to bring, this might not be exactly the angle you're looking at, but fish ponds. I've often thought fish ponds are something that could be renewed as a food resource and yet really help with climate change things. So for me, that's something to explore, is just pioneering that shoreline and trying to make it as well as mitigate impacts coming inwards, try to make a food production system. But I think it's a really good question. I think that's pioneer territory. We have lots of lands. Amazingly enough, we have lots of lands on Maui that would be suitable for that. And so I think, I don't know the answer, but I think it's a great question, to be honest. And I was always told that good questions deserve really good answers. And so that answer is, one that has to be developed, and I don't mean to be jumping that question, but I just do think that that's the direction of the future. And so that's where we need to go. So great question. I hope I didn't tear it up too much.
Well, that was great, Art. Thank you. Another question from Amjad is, where do you get regional genetics in, say, an urban or waste environment, such as Central Maui or the whole Ahupua'a of Waikiki?
That's a really good question. I don't think you can get regional genetics. And so then I think you just step back to your next available ones. Your reference ecosystem would be, if you follow that scheme of things, you would then, instead of trying to get something from Waikiki, you would be looking for analog systems that are similar to Waikiki that maybe are intact. Doesn't even have to be on Oahu, preferably on Oahu, but you're trying to design that. So I think that would be the next thing. But the most important thing is that you just state what you did, And so if, But to be honest, before I would enter that stage, I really would look around. There's often some small point on Diamond Head where there's going to be a little bit of a lima or something like that, a few plants left, and taking those plants and making many. For me, there's something about that that is really actually romantic, you know, almost to the public. I think the public gets it. It's the idea of chasing the past. I think when you bring in plants from another site, you do create a kind of a Disneyland. You already start with the Disneyland thing, you know, and as well as you don't have plants that are as adapted. So I probably think I would start off with really looking, making sure, and even at Diamond Head, if you're talking about Waikiki, or, you know, if you're talking about some other area, you know, I would really make sure to look, especially in these little rocky. And once you've gone past that, looking for analog sites that are similar to that, even on another island that's climatically like that. And then I think as long as you're documenting what you're doing, I think you're good.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Johan Lal. Do you usually want plants from the area you're restoring, or a mix of seeds from different places for more genetic diversity in the population?
What a good question. I think that is, you know, when I first started, I would have said you only want plants from the same area, and SER is now saying that you should use a mix of plants. I would actually say in Hawaii, it's a really dynamic question, and there isn't one answer, because, you know, how far are you going to go out before you start? You know, I think the ultimate thing is that we're probably providing some adaptation for climate change, and that it's changes in the system. But for me, especially working with leeward plants, they have a long evolutionary history of surviving droughts. So if I'm working in Hawaii, do I move out to other islands? Do I move out to other volcanoes? To me, that seems too far. I'm not gaining an advantage. Do I move to lower habitats where perhaps I'm getting more drought resistance? Do I move to adjacent districts? That's my interpretation of that recommendation, is that in the Hawaiian setting, I don't want to move too far. I do want to move down where I think that it's going to be a harsher, more drought prone environment, and I will move on districts on both sides. But especially as you move to other tracks, like in Hawaii, you can actually, I actually know a case where people argued this very similar situation and decided to bring in plants from another area, and then in the end it turned out that that was a different species. But that had been decided after the fact, because I mean, it wasn't their fault, they didn't know about it, but that people said, wow, these differences are so profound. That's an extreme example, and I wouldn't kind of use it too much, but I would say that the point is to gain, the point of that whole gaining, adding genetic diversity is to increase the likelihood of the ecosystem being successful if the environment is slightly changing or adapting toward climate change effects. And so I think that's to keep in mind in a Hawaiian ecosystem. The question is one that I and staff talk about all the time: how far, and to go out. But that's my opinion, is going out too far, I believe, I don't want to say it can be counterproductive, because what's the problem with it? The problem is that you're gonna have a gene kind of explosion, and you're gonna have reselection. So in a way that's good, but in some ways, I'm not sure if we have time for all that, especially when we're using for some plants like ule and a'ali'i. I'm probably over answering this question, but for some plants, I think I'm interested in them as nurse plants. And so I'm really interested in their immediate performance, actually. And so I hope those are elements of the answer, but I think it's a really good question. I ask it myself all the time. I don't have a precise answer, but that's probably what I would say, is that I do it moderately, but I don't take it out. In Hawaii especially, I'm a little bit concerned about what happens when you take it out beyond the immediate few, like beyond your moku. And if you're looking at Hawaiian land divisions, if you know Hawaiian land divisions.
Great answer. Thanks, Art. Another question from Laura Bales. Aloha, mahalo for sharing your mana'o. Could you talk a little bit about how forest restoration affects the water resources in your area in Hawaii? Also, if native species aren't available in the surrounding restoration area, what is the best way to ethically source native plants for outplanting?
If native, let's take the second one first, because it's more specific. If native plants aren't available, how do you source? I'm sorry, could you repeat, please?
Yep. If native species are not available in the surrounding restoration area, what's the best ethical protocol to source native plants for outplanting?
That's a really good question. I would probably, I mean, I would use my own expertise to try to figure out what the nearest native one, either geographically or in terms of a climate analog. But the practical thing is, if you don't know the system, is to try to find a regional expert. Is to find, the botanical gardens are awesome. Anybody at the botanical garden, if you just start inquiring, hey, who knows a lot about plants that I could ask questions about? And maybe you are that person. And if you are, forgive me. But I'm just trying to say that, like if I came into a new area, that's the first question I would ask is, hey, I've got a restoration project in the shoreline and I can't find any native plants in this area. And I think this might be a good, those kind of leading questions where you give a little information, you're going to get a lot of information. But it is basically, you're trying to go for six. Part of it is honoring the past. Okay, so if there's something there, you're going to try to honor that. If, like I probably said before, the first thing I'd probably do is really walk around a little bit and make sure that it really isn't there, because you don't want to bring in other things and then find you do have a population. You're trying not to disturb what's there. So that's what I probably first do. And then after that, you're trying to, if you've eliminated that, there's nothing there, and you kind of honor that part of it, that ethical part of it, then for me, you're after project success. Now I really want something that's as best I can adapted for this site. And that's probably where I'd pick an analog site, even on another island. But I think as long as you make that clear, what you did, that's the whole thing of flight. I would call it flight following, that I just record what I did. I brought these in from this, I mixed this, I brought these in from lower elevations. I think that, we keep a running log of that. Who knows what will ever happen to it? Maybe nothing will ever happen to it. But I just think knowing what you do and passing it on is part of that archaeological kind of carefulness that we need to bring. I think your question shows that you're being careful. But I hadn't really thought about these things, but because I haven't really worked in too many analog sites like that, but because usually I know where the plants are. But that would be the first thing I would do. I would look around, because I think a lot of people haven't looked around into these areas. And so you might find native plants where you don't expect them to. I hope that answered your question.
Great, thanks, Art. Can you just touch a little bit about how forest restoration affects the water resources in Hawaii?
Wow. Well, it's a complicated question, right? I mean, clearly we know it does. Water is gonna hit. I mean, this is a hydrologist should be here, and maybe Erica can answer this as well as anybody. But water is going to fall on our windward slopes almost no matter what. But fog interception is something that forests bring on both windward and leeward slopes, and it's this idea of also slowing and kind of percolating and holding the forest there, holding the water onto the forest. That's going to play a really critical role. We know that certainly pigs have an accelerating role in causing sedimentation, but it's probably also that invasive plants do. So the USGS, I shouldn't even speak too soon, because USGS is doing some quantitative work right now that'll provide real answers as to what forest types will make the best forest. We know that forests intercept water. We know that they percolate water, and they actually control water fall through so that it doesn't cause too much erosion. We know all those beneficial things. We don't know. I don't think we quantitatively know the difference between forest types. So do they help? Yes. Do we know the difference between types? I think that information is being generated right now between the Water Department and USGS. So we'll know a lot more. I don't want to say more than that, because I think that's what we know.
Okay, great answer and great questions, everyone. We have a few more questions. It is 12:23. The first question, another question from CJ from Maui. Does the Oahe project or program have or will directly influence or impact Kaho'olawe?
Kaho'olawe. Wow. I think the automatic answer would be no, it's too small. And the answer that I would have is I sure hope so. Because I hope that the idea that you can restore forests, because there's definitely a thought that the leeward forests of Kaho'olawe have an impact on the leeward forests of Haleakala have an impact on the hydrology of Kaho'olawe. We have no quantitative evidence, clearly, but I think there's some real suggestive evidence that, to me, I'm not a hydrologist, I'm not Thomas Jambaluka, who probably would give you the answer that no, I don't think we have any quantitative evidence that there would be a difference. But if the southern Haleakala was forested, I think it would have an impact on Kaho'olawe. And so that would be my hope. So I think the technical answer is no, it doesn't. But the longer answer is that restoration of the Auloa, the cloud that used to go between the two places, is in chant and story, and perhaps more than that. You know, when I was a younger man, there used to be a cloud, Naulu cloud, that used to stretch across the mountain. And some people used to call it the 10 o'clock cloud because it would always usually come up at 10 o'clock in the morning and then kind of fade away in the afternoon. That cloud isn't as present as it used to be now these days. And so it's anyhow, it's just anecdotal evidence or anecdotal, but I would just say that reforesting southern Haleakala or leeward Haleakala might definitely have an impact on Kaho'olawe. But the technical answer is going to be our small disclosure probably doesn't.
Great, thank you, Art. Can we ask you one more question? Do you have time? One more? Thank you. Mary Ann from NPS had a great question. I believe she is trying to say, do you have any recommendations for flood channels on the leeward Kona Bank for bank stabilization? Any ideas or suggestions?
Not without looking at the site. Is it Mary?
Yep, Mary Ann.
Mary Ann, not without looking at the site, and that's just out of respect to your site. I think my email is on the presentation. If you email me pictures, I would be stoked to help you in any way I can. You know, so if you just show me any kind of pictures or maps, I'm always happy to help Park Service people. Park Service preserves a really important part of our national heritage, and they're in dynamic situations now. So if I can help, please let me.
Great, thanks, Art. One last question is, this is from JB Friday, does the certification for ecological restoration practitioner include requirements for horticulture, weed management, pest and disease management? Managers need practical training, which is true.
Yep. JB is a colleague of mine and a dear friend and does some great work on the Big Island. So first of all, I would say aloha to JB. JB, I don't really think that some of those are in there. I think it's mostly focused on restoration stuff. I'd have to ask another colleague. I think it's mostly focused, they're peripheral topics. I would agree. I would probably agree with you. I think of course the idea, and you'd probably agree with this, is where do you stop? We need a whole degree. We need a four-year degree program, clearly. Maybe you can help with that.
All right, well, thank you so much, Art. Mahalo nui.